Stanford University.
Hello, my name is James Mark, and I'm a professor emeritus of cardiothoracic surgery at Stanford. Today is February 11th, 2015, and we're sitting in a Stanford Medical School conference room. From 1908 till 1959, the clinical portion of Stanford's medical school is located in San Francisco, 35 miles from Palo Alto, where the basic sciences were taught on the Stanford campus. In 1959, the entire medical school operation was moved to Palo Alto. The purpose of today's session is to talk about the visions behind that move and the impacts it had on the future of medical education, research, teaching, and patient care at Stanford University School of Medicine. Before I introduce the other participants in today's discussion, a little history might be useful. Stanford Medical School began in San Francisco in 1908, when the Board of Trustees of Cooper Medical College gifted the school and all its assets to Stanford University. This was about the time of the Flexner Report on medical education in the United States and Canada. This landmark book-length report was commissioned by the Carnegie Foundation. Until this time, medical schools had been proprietary, for-profit institutions not associated with universities and without widely accepted entrance or graduation requirements. Following the Flexner Report, academic standards were put into place and medical education was changed forever. After World War II, medical education at Stanford hit the doldrums. Basic science research lagged, the educational program became stagnant, and the physical facilities were outmoded. It became clear that a major reorganization was needed. J.E. Wallace Sterling, the president of Stanford University at that time, was a key figure stimulating this reorganization. The Board of Trustees then approved moving the clinical activities to a new hospital in Palo Alto, and at the same time, strengthening basic science teaching and research and developing a new curriculum. One can only imagine the excitement engendered by such a move on the one hand and the strong opposition to it on the other. The opposition came not only from some medical school faculty, but from some of the practicing physicians in Palo Alto and the Santa Clara County Medical Society as well. But the move did take place in 1959. New basic science facilities were built, along with a new hospital owned half by the university and half by the city of Palo Alto. The hospital, designed by Edward Durrell Stone, cost $21 million to build. Now let me introduce our participants. I'd first like to introduce Dr. Herbert Abrams. Herb came to Stanford in 1948, and except for a stint as chairman of radiology at Harvard, has been here ever since. He's internationally known as a pioneer in cardiovascular imaging and has had a long-term interest in the prevention of nuclear war. He was the founding vice president of International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, an organization which was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. There's Phil Sunshine. Phil is a pediatrician who first came to Stanford as a resident in 1956. He's the father of neonatology at Stanford and a nationally recognized leader in the field. Phil has been a mentor to a generation of neonatologists at Stanford and is still active clinically, taking care of the tiny tots in the neonatal intensive care unit. To my right is Stan Schrier. Dr. Schrier is a hematologist who began his faculty career at Stanford in 1959, just as the school was leaving San Francisco. He has held positions of leadership in his field at both national and international levels and was president of the American Society of Hematologists. Dr. Schrier still sees patients and participates in clinical research on anemia in the elderly. And on my far right is Paul Berg. Paul came to Stanford in Palo Alto in 1959 with Arthur Kornberg and colleagues from Washington University in St. Louis to form Stanford's new Department of Biochemistry. Among the many honors which he has been awarded are the National Medal of Science, the National Library of Medicine Medal, and the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for his work involving nucleic acids and recombinant DNA. Let's start with Phil first. You've been here the longest. You were in San Francisco first as a resident. What was the school like at the time?
You realize I was only there for 1 year, and the Department of Pediatrics was a very small department at the time. The residents spent half of their time at Stanford Lane Hospital and half of their time down at the San Francisco General Hospital, where most of the action was in the admission emergency room. When I started off at the county hospital, San Francisco General, there was one Stanford faculty involved in the education of the house staff and students at that time, a gentleman by the name of Ed Sens. And he was readily available for consultation. There were informal rounds, so most of the teaching that was done by house staff to other house staff and to students. After 6 months, I rotated to the Stanford Lane Hospital, where there was more formalized teaching, but it consisted of grand rounds once a week and clinical conference once a week. Very few formal rounds were held. Most of our teaching was provided by community physicians, including gentlemen such as Al Jacobs, Marty Gershman, both of whom have passed on, Saul Robinson in cardiology, who also has passed on, and very few faculty were readily available. So most of our teaching was done ad hoc, on the run, essentially.
Was there any research going on in the department at the time?
The only person that was doing a little bit of research at that time was Ruth Gross, who was studying the developmental aspects of glucose-6-phosphate dehydrogenase. And I remember...
Hey, I partly discovered that.
Well, the only thing that I was involved in was drawing blood from newborns to give to Ruth Hurwitz, who was Toby's research associate. And as far as I could tell, that was probably the only research that was going on in the department.
When you moved to Palo Alto, what did you find here? I mean, what was here waiting for you? Anything?
Yeah, I'll tell you what was found here. We were still in the old Palo Alto Hospital. The pediatric ward was in a little Quonset hut attached to the hospital. And I couldn't believe it when I came down to see that patients were cared for in this facility. When I was in the Navy in Taipei, working at a dispensary, we had much better facilities. But after 6 months, we moved into the new Stanford Hospital, which was wonderful. But when I came out of the Navy back in July of 1959, teaching was wonderful at that time. Lou Gluck was recruited as a head of neonatology, and he just made neonatology a fascinating subject.
Fascinating enough for you to choose as a career.
That's right. He just turned me on to neonatal care. He was wonderful. Norman had already started here, and of course...
That's Norman Kretschmer,
Norman Kretschmer, yeah. His recruitment was sort of an afterthought. The recruitment was trying to get Dr. Sidney Gillis, who was considered the pediatrician in the United States, to come to Stanford. He almost came. He was going to bring Norman Kretschmer as his research professor, and then at the last minute backed out. Norman was then recruited to come, and when he came, he had a sparse group of people to work with. He had Dr. Luzzati, who had come down from Stanford up in the city, Andrew Hunt, who he recruited from Haverford. Norm Sisman was just recruited as a pediatric cardiologist. Dr. Gross, who was here, immediately took a sabbatical, and Norman had to build a department from scratch.
It looks like he had a pretty good start, though.
Well, I thought he had a much better start after the first year when he was able to recruit Herb Schwartz, who relieved Stanley from the having to take care of children with hematological disease. He recruited Bob Greenberg, who was an outstanding young man in metabolism, and Irv Schaefer. And Norman always tried to recruit young people and give them the opportunity to develop their careers.
Stanley, you came to Stanford in San Francisco from Hopkins and the University of Chicago. Why in the world did you come out here at that time?
So let's make it the spring of '59, and by that time I'd finished my training in medicine and hematology. I'd had a fellowship sort of as part of the NIH when I was sent to jail to study this disease that Toby Gross tried to do some work with. And I had finished my training, and I was ready for an academic job. And my wife had gone to undergraduate school in Oakland at Mills. And she said, before you settle down, we ought to go out to look at San Francisco, because I'd fallen in love with it. And so it was easy to contact the hematologist at Stanford. The hematologist consisted of Bill Krieger. And so I sent him a note and set up an appointment. And we got to San Francisco, and I looked around. I liked San Francisco. I looked at a couple of practice opportunities. They were hot for hematologists in the area. But I went to interview with Bill at the old Stanford Lane on Clay and Webster Street. And I walked into the building, and I don't think Phil's told you about what a dump it was. It was falling down. And I interviewed with Bill, and at the end of an hour, it seemed to be going pretty well. And I wondered what was going to happen next. And then he said, "You're hired." You know, when I think about how the situation is now, we recruit and we have visits, we go back and forth, and then we choose the wrong person. So, and he said, "You're hired." And I said, what do I do now? He said, "You have to go talk to our chair of medicine." So the chair of medicine at the time was David Reitan. And in good Stanford tradition, he'd been fired in the preparation for the move, but they said to him, "We fired you, but could you stay on as acting chief until we find somebody?" So it's a little not so gracious.
It sounds to me like it was your wife that wanted to come to San Francisco that tipped the balance.
It was. It was. And you know, it all started with that. And so I don't know if you want me to go on. But
Well, you moved then right away, almost immediately you got here.
Almost immediately, and I got here, I remember it exactly, I got here on July 9th, 1959, and moved in, and I discovered that the hospital, where it sits now, they had dug the pit for the fountains, and they were busy putting the floor in to what would then be the Edwards building, which is the first place where I made ward rounds on Stanford patients. And then I found myself as the junior hematologist, since there are only two of us. And then I also discovered that I was responsible for running the clinical hematology laboratory. The director was Bill, but it was my job. So I read all the smears, I read all the bone marrows. And that turned out to be interesting in a curious financial way. I was paid $2,000 a year to run the laboratory. But the Palo Alto Times had done an expose about several months before, which showed that the pathologists were pulling out $125,000 a year from the lab. So when I introduced myself to people in the community, they thought I was making $125,000 a year instead of $8,000. And that was one of the interesting exchanges that had to happen as we moved into the system.
Let me ask Paul now. You came from Washington to U in St. Louis with Arthur Kornberg and the rest of that department. I mean, could that happen again, a whole department moving out here?
Well, let me set the stage for
Please.
that very unusual event. Arthur Kornberg had been recruited to Washington University to become professor of microbiology. He was the head of that department, but there was no other faculty. And so he spent about 2 or 3 years recruiting an entirely new group of faculty, mostly young people who had just finished their postdoc period, all given assistant professorships or instructorships. We were all biochemists or structural biochemists, microbiologists. None of us were microbiologists. But we took the job knowing that we were going to have to teach microbiology, even though we were doing biochemistry by all ways. Here at Stanford, it was a very unusual situation, as you described early. Namely, the basic sciences were really very, very poor state. And when the move was planned, one of the first things that was planned was to actually build up the basic sciences. Now, biochemistry didn't exist as such. The medical students doing their preclinical years down here actually took biochemistry from a chemistry professor. And that was considered not to be adequate. There was no research in biochemistry. So the resident faculty, 2 people, Henry Kaplan, who was a professor of radiology, but actually had great ambitions in research and was very effective in that way, and Avram Goldstein. Avram Goldstein had been recruited somewhere during the late 50s as the new professor of pharmacology. Avram was an active scientist. He'd come from Harvard, and I think he recognized the poor state of biochemistry at Stanford. Somewhere along the line, and a little murky for me, the suggestion was made, well, let me step back a moment first. So there was a very prominent biochemist in the biology department. His name was Edward Tatum. Edward Tatum was a worldwide figure, and in fact was to get the Nobel Prize in 1958. He was recruited to become professor of biochemistry to create a new department. Unfortunately, he had a divorce with his wife, and the circumstances of remaining in the area were difficult for him, and so he went to Rockefeller University. So we were left, or Stanford was left without a professor, a head of biochemistry. At the urging of Henry Kaplan and Avram Goldstein, they settled on approaching Arthur Kornberg. Now, Arthur Kornberg was, I think, at the time, probably considered in the top 5 biochemists in this country. So it was a plum that they were going for. I remember that Arthur Kornberg was invited to come and make his recruiting visit, to give a lecture. And I remember him telling me before he left, when we were in St. Louis, he said, I am not interested in moving. I've just built up this department. It's going to be a great department. I don't see any reason to move, but I have to go because my good friend Henry Kaplan has urged me to at least to show up and consider it. He made the trip, and there was an interesting anecdote he told when he came back. First of all, he came back very enthusiastic about what was happening at Stanford. The move into these new facilities right on the campus, with a lot of very interesting scientists already in place, in the chemistry department, in the biology department. And so when he came back, he was a changed person. He was very enthusiastic about what was going to happen. And he told this incident, one of it, he said, was very instrumental in persuading him. After he gave his lecture, which he was now engaged in the work on synthesizing DNA, very promising work. And he gave this lecture to a very large audience. And he was also provided with an open-air convertible that he could use during the stay he was here.
Nice.
And and he went into a service station to get some gas. And he was astonished because the young man who was pumping the gas for him said he really enjoyed Kornberg's lecture. And so Kornberg took that as if people pumping gas will go to a lecture on DNA, that's the place to come to.
You know, there's a story that is told, and I can't vouch for its veracity, about Henry Kaplan prior to that particular search, that he was discontent, as Henry frequently was, with the pace of things and what was going on. And he threatened to go to Harvard, and he had apparently had the opportunity to talk to Wally Sterling, who was president of the university, and he said, Wally, unless you recruit me some intellectual playmates, I'm going to Harvard. So that was kind of the springboard where he then talked to Arthur and your whole department to come out here.
Well, he had spent some time in Arthur Kornberg's lab at the NIH. And so he knew Kornberg well. I think he admired him greatly. And so I think when it came to trying to bring his playmate, Kornberg would have been a high priority target. But when Kornberg came back, he said, I will not accept this appointment at Stanford unless you all come with me. All meaning all of the young assistant professors he had recruited to the department. And so we had many, many evenings over beer and food and snacks discussing should we not. He made it clear that he would not move unless all of us came with him. And ultimately, we all agreed that it would be great for each of us to come to Stanford as well. From my own point of view, I'd always had an ambition to come to Stanford. I actually had considered coming here as an undergraduate. So the prospect of being able to come here as a faculty member was really very attractive. So what was so attractive? What was attractive was the opportunity to create a new teaching program in biochemistry, to have completely new facilities, very modern, given the comparison to what we had at Washington. It was even almost as decrepit as the Stanford Hospital was that you all came from. And I think there were very exciting people in the chemistry department, very exciting people in the biology department, and we could see that we had the opportunity for interact with a lot of people that were already here, which was not available to us at Washington University, mainly because the medical school and the university are separated by at least 3 or 4 miles, and that distance made it very difficult to go and visit, attend seminars.
Let me interject a brief anecdote about my own recruitment out here by Bob Chase. And one of the people he took me to see was Arthur Kornberg. And I felt like getting out my autograph book, you know. Arthur was at the green board with chalk, diagramming something, and he, as much as said, if Chase wants you, it's okay with me, he said to me, but you've got to understand that we here at Stanford have the full-time system. We're all on salary. You don't keep your professional fees. And I said, yes, sir, but I almost added the fact that, sir, I come from Yale, which is the only other university medical school in the country with the same system. Herb, you've been at Stanford the longest. What was the culture like of Stanford Medical School in the city?
It was very much like a small town. We all ate lunch across the street on a long table, so that you'd mix in with the physiologists and the pathologists and everyone in the clinical departments for sure. And in the course of those conversations, patients would be discussed, problems would be analyzed. It was a very cozy kind of atmosphere. In the teaching arena, we had the set clinics, which were basically focused on one subject and rotated among internal medicine, surgery, pathology, pediatrics, and radiology. And what was fantastic about them was that the chief of every service was present right there, ready to be grilled, and he was grilled, and they simply made time for the kinds of human interactions that are very difficult in a larger geographic area. The students, meanwhile, were exposed to their mentors being pretty severely questioned, and learned how to respond in a way simply by following the conversation throughout. Now, this was a group, remember, that was all mixed up with a large number of physicians who were part of the staff and who were so-called geographic full-time. They taught at the undergraduate level, they taught the residents, but they also had a private practice. And that really was the source of most of their income. there were only two departments which were full-time. Those were radiology and pathology, and we just got a fixed salary. Mine was very generous. I started out at $4,000 a year and slowly crept up. The people like Victor Richards, who was a professor of surgery, and Frank Gerbode, who was also a professor of surgery, were among those. There were many in the internal medicine community who were deeply opposed to the move.
Was there any research effort of significance at Stanford in San Francisco in the clinical sciences?
There was clinical research that went on in a continuum, some of it very good, some of it
Like
not
the
so
old days of, I've done 100 of these operations and this is what I've learned?
Yeah, but that's a lot of clinical medical
Yeah.
research, or it was.
Unacceptable
time.
today.
It was at that time. And in the divisions that grew up about the move to the campus, those who were closely aligned with San Francisco were very articulate and very strong, as were one or two of the faculty who really understood that going to the campus was a means of integrating the medical school into the university as a whole and giving the opportunity for cross-disciplinary research, teaching, and intellectual discourse.
That must have been a very exciting concept. I understand that Yank Chandler, who was the dean for many years, quit over the fact that the move was going to take place, and his successor, Windsor Cutting, was not much more enthusiastic about it, and he got fired. Now, is there truth to those rumors?
There certainly is a measure of truth to both of them. The head of pediatrics at that time was John Anderson, and John was accompanied by the rest of the chairs. He had come from Minnesota, and he was no more enthusiastic about it than the head of medicine or the head of surgery. But the intimacy of the place, it can be contrasted to what happened when we moved down. In some respects, in the basic sciences, people could contact very easily when we moved down. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Right now, there's a fellow from internal medicine by the name of Relman, who is the director of the Center for International Security and Cooperation. Right near his office is the office of William Perry, former Secretary of Defense and collaborator right now with the guy who has just been appointed, Ash Carter, as the new Secretary of Defense. That would be impossible if we were still in the city. You could never get
It probably couldn't be done at any other medical school, no matter where it's located. So let me ask about, it's my understanding too, I mean, finance was a big problem in the move, going from geographic full-time to a full-time salaried system. But it's also my understanding that the powers that be decided not to invite some of the chairs or some of the faculty to come down, forgetting the remuneration system because they weren't the kind of person they wanted in the new school in Palo Alto. Is there truth to that?
I don't think there's any question but that Vic Richards would have been invited down, and Dave Reitan, of course, as acting.
Yeah, but he was fired. He was told that he wouldn't be the chair when we moved down there, but please stay as acting. It's a little bit ungracious.
Yeah, he was acting chair.
Yeah.
They made no fire. You're right. But he filled in
He did.
for a while.
Let's get another view on what happened when we got here from Paul.
I'll go back just a point. Henry Kaplan, who was one of the more prominent and highly visible professors in San Francisco, but he was very much involved with people down here in applied physics. In fact, the development of the linear accelerator was in fact a joint project between Henry and somebody down here. So one could easily see why Henry would have been very enthusiastic and pushing for moving down here, because those are the kinds of interactions he valued. Those are the interactions that we sought, and those are the interactions that we actually achieved by the move.
And behind it all, if Henry wants something, most of the time he's going to get
Well,
it.
he was an
Not all the
agitator.
time.
He was an agitator for sure.
Yep.
And as I say, as you quoted earlier, he implored from the president to provide him with more playmates. By playmates, he actually meant people who were his intellectual equal, or those that he could actually interact with and benefit from in his own research. So
This also brings up one of the major objections to the move that was heard throughout the decade of the 50s. You won't have any patients down
That's
there.
exactly right.
Yeah,
Well,
and believe me,
Yeah,
you
well,
know,
that's another problem which we're going to get to when we get back to Schrier in a minute, but I want Paul to talk a little more about the teaching down here and what biochemistry did and the evolution of the curriculum.
in our own discussions about whether we were going to move from St. Louis and come to Stanford, there were a number of factors that were very important to all of us. One was, as biochemists, we were going to be authentic biochemists in a real biochemistry department rather than doing biochemistry under the rubric of microbiology. Second, we could see the opportunities of greater interactions with other department people, scientists all through the campus, which did not exist for us in St. Louis. Abram Goldstein came and described what was going to be the new medical school format, accepting students perhaps after only, without having had their baccalaureate degree, but coming into a program which was going to be over 5 years. There was going to be sufficient time for students to engage in research, and even for students to engage and complete advanced degrees in masters in any other subject that they were interested in. There was a ferment. The whole feeling was that this was an exciting new development. Stanford was stepping out to do something that was unusual, and here was an opportunity for us to come as a unit, and I'll amplify that for a moment, and be part of that new process, and actually look forward to actually building on the strengths that we brought. So what was unique? Unique was that a department of 7 people flourishing at Washington University in St. Louis moved en masse, all 7, to become the new Department of Biochemistry. People have marveled at how that happened. It's an interesting fact that of those 7 that here, 5 are still here. 1 died in the course of all this 50-some-6 years. And that showed the kind of interactions in loyalty, coherence, and the interactions that we've actually had in our research and teaching. Every one of those 6 or 7 have become members of the National Academy of Sciences. Each of them has become presidents of their own particular professional societies. They've been offered some of the most lucrative positions anywhere, and yet they all remained at Stanford. So that speaks enormously for the kind of interactions that within the department, but also the interactions that were created throughout the school.
Tell us a little bit about what I'm going to call the microsystem of your research. In other words, it was shared space, shared information, much more sharing than you find in most departmental research efforts.
When I joined Kornberg's department in St. Louis, he said to me, "Don't worry about a grant. I've got lots of money. You just
Nice.
Just do your work. And for years, I did not have to apply for a grant. Now, Kornberg had a firm belief that full focus on the research, not worrying about money, was most important. And so as people came into the department, we then had to begin to raise some money. But he told us to, I remember him telling me, don't ask for more than $5,000. This is a means for getting your name into the process of grant applications, but we won't really need that money. And so over the years, as we all grew, we developed a system in which all the money went into one pot. Our salaries came from the university, but supplies and equipment and everything we needed to fund the department running came out of the pot, everybody having equal access to that pot. As people were promoted, became assistant associate professors, there was no difference as to whether rank you were or position or your fame. Everybody had access to the same pot. And that was done for a very deliberate reason. If you recruit young people, what you want them to focus on is development of their ideas. You don't want money to be the limiting factor. And so that has provided the impetus for allowing young faculty to move much more quickly, develop their programs much more effectively than if they had to worry about raising their own funds and managing their own funds.
Contrast that with what happens today in research. You spend more time fiddling with grants than you do doing the research.
So I got a note from the NIA, National Institute of Aging today. I have a grant there. And the head said, now don't be disappointed, but the cut line now is 4% in one percentile in one category, 7% in the other. That means out of 100 proposals, 4 may get funded and then cut. So now it couldn't be more different than the sort of
well, the
generous productive system.
1950s were
The heyday.
In biomedical science. There's no question about that. And I think because of the success of the department and the work that was going on there, we never really had a problem of raising money. So money was not much of an issue.
Did the funds come in a center grant or something?
No. They came to individuals, and we had a business manager, and all the money was considered, all the supply money, equipment money, all the kinds of salaries for technicians and so on went into a common pot. And the business manager was there to make sure that
the
each
cops
grant
didn't come get you.
didn't leave money in it at the end of the year. So, for example, if I needed to buy a certain amount of chemicals and I didn't have the funds in my own grant, it was paid for by taking money from Kornberg's grant. At that time, it didn't make any difference. Most of us were doing pretty much the same kind of work. So if you wanted to isolate enzymes, we were all using the same enzymes. It didn't make any difference who paid for the enzymes. So, but that was relatively short-lived.
I hope there's a statute of limitations
Yeah.
on telling us about that system.
I think actually the people at the NIH recognized that this was the most efficient way to use the funds we had, because we didn't have the situation where each faculty member had to have a centrifuge. We had 3 centrifuges, everybody had access to them. Same thing for almost everything we bought. But unfortunately, eventually they came to the point that the accounting for each grant became more and more strict, and ultimately, as it is now, everybody's on their own pot.
But you could interchange. You could take money from like salaries and use it for
Absolutely, yes.
Well,
Yes.
how about in
and things
medicine?
like
What
that.
was it like in medicine? I want to get to the clinical part, but just comment on the research for the moment.
It was a little bit like the Balkans. We hated each other. Not in a physical sense, but each unit had its own grant. I had to apply for my own grants. My own grants were managed by me, and the amount of sharing in the Department of Medicine was 0. We knew you guys were doing this. We were totally envious because it was clear that you were the cutting edge of the future. Unfortunately, it hasn't stuck. The system now, as you know, is each person in his own silo, sort of doing his own thing. And you guys were incredible about doing
Yeah,
that.
we shared our reagents, we shared our ideas. When I frequently disclose that almost everything that I needed to do the experiment for which I got the Nobel Prize actually came from Arthur Kornberg's refrigerator. And with full knowledge, I wasn't stealing it. I mean, everything was available to anybody.
To everybody
and
else.
The idea of somebody developed a method, it was the information of how to use it was diffused through the department extremely quickly. One of the things that the department had, which was unique and probably is unique in the annals of any kind of science, is we shared all the space. So we had a floor of roughly, I don't know how many, 20,000 square feet, laboratories spread throughout, and a few offices. Faculty had an office, and all their students were distributed around the department. So any one laboratory you went into, there could be somebody from Kornberg's lab, somebody from mine lab, somebody from Dale Kaiser's lab, somebody from Dave Hogness's lab. What that did was permitted the diffusion of ideas and information and equipment and reagents tremendously. So anything that was discovered in one group's research lab was known to everybody extremely quickly.
It sounds idyllic and probably cannot be repeated.
Well, it takes, we've often thought about, remember, this was 6 people besides Kornberg, all about the same age, all coming in from postdocs, all extremely motivated and effective, and we grew up together. And there was never any animosity. We never had a quarrel. We never were scratching for something that the other person didn't want to share or had. We met frequently. It is not surprising that 4 of us live exactly within spitting distance of each other, and our kids essentially grew up together. So it was a family. It was a family feeling in a department which exists to this day.
That's been able to be replicated or at least continued all over these 50 years?
Well, 5 of us are
Still
emeritus
there.
and still at Stanford. We all come to the faculty meeting. I came from a faculty meeting this morning. And we all still come to the faculty meeting. We all participate in the affairs of the department. We're not running research labs anymore, but we're considered the elders
yeah.
with something to contribute.
Well, I think that's absolutely special and probably couldn't happen anywhere again.
And I think the other thing which is a development, we taught a extremely novel biochemistry course for the medical students. It was available to Stanford undergraduates as well. And as you will know, everyone, younger people in the clinical departments were invited and attended the biochemistry lectures. To this day, I meet people in Paris, France, wherever, telling me that they remember the lectures.
You guys were superb lecturers. I remember yours and Arthur's lectures were incredible. Their organization and clarity. It's a field I didn't know.
Yeah.
But you guys were very good at it, so you took your teaching very seriously.
We took it seriously, and we monitored each other's lectures. So in fact, you could walk into that amphitheater room and look up at the top of the level there, and you saw all your colleagues
There
sitting
were
up
your
there,
peers up there.
sitting in, listening to your lecture, and getting feedback.
Yeah, I want to interject. I took biochemistry in medical school in 1951. When I was a fellow in 1961 in Norm Kretschmer's laboratory, he asked me, or told me, you will go to the biochemistry class.
Yeah.
I thought it would be a seance, recalling that this is all brand new stuff in 1961. 10 years later.
Stanley, let's get to the clinical aspect of things. You got down here, I mean, where were the patients?
So this was, and Paul's told you about the innovative stuff that Arthur and his gang brought to us, and all of a sudden it changed us from being sort of a so-so medical school, my apologies, Herb, into one of a cutting-edge operation. But what Stanford did was something which the rest of the country thought was idiotic. Every other major medical school works out of a hospital in a large city, and the hospital is usually the county hospital, and you're dealing with a destitute population. So here was Stanford that was going to do 2 things all of a sudden. It was going to move out of the city, and not out of the city, but onto a campus, and the campus was going to be in a middle-class community. This was not heard of because the dogma in medical schools was that you needed this population to allow the patients to be taken care of by med students and house staff. Otherwise, why should they do that when they had the private community? So Stanford took this interesting, innovative step, almost akin to what you guys did, and said, we're going to move down here, we're going to be close to the science, and we're going to make ourselves good enough to be accepted by a middle-class community, and they're going to be okay with us having used those patients for teaching for house staff and students. So that was the dream, and we came down here with this. Now the dream was a bit, I would say, romantic, and I'll get a little bit more into that, because when we got down here, the patients were not so easy to find. The large population base that was supposed to be necessary for teaching was not easily here. And so for a while we had to develop our patient load and our referral base by working quite hard, and we had a little bit upstream fight. I remember you telling me that the Santa Clara County Medical Society voted not to have us.
That's right.
They didn't want us
They
down
were
here.
against the move.
They were against the move. Why were they against the move? We were going to take patients away.
Exactly.
And that was a competitive situation which existed when we arrived here. So when we arrived here, Kaiser was doing sort of Kaiser things beginning to grow, but we found here Palo Alto Medical Foundation, PAMP, and the Menlo Clinic, and they're doing very well and having a pretty large patient base, and we have a very good group of private physicians, and all of a sudden we're down here and we're competing with them. And it was an interesting complexity. It turned out that Wally's personal physician was Russell Van Ardsdale Lee, who is the chair, the boss of the Palo Alto Clinic. And Russ Lee had told Wally that there was no problem. Palo Alto Clinic would take care of the patients. The professors would sit in their offices and do research or whatever sort it was, and everything would go smoothly. Except it doesn't work like that. The faculty has to be involved in what we now call translation. You're going to the laboratory, new adventures to the clinic, clinical trials. And so we immediately found ourselves in a conflictual situation in a hospital that was divided. This part was the community here. This part was Stanford. Herb will tell you that there were 2 radiology departments, and you had to, when you had your patients sent for a procedure, you had to decide which unit they would go to. But the one thing that was unified was the clinical laboratory, and I was in the hematology part of the clinical laboratory trying to be even-handed with both parts of the situation.
Without being critical, I don't think every member of the Department of Medicine really wanted to develop a clinical practice for teaching or for anything else.
So I think,
Jim.
that's, so we can get, this gets into a complex situation. The physicians who are very much clinically active and had geographic full-time practices doing quite nicely in San Francisco did not want to come down. And so on my first department, I was the first appointee of the new Department of Medicine. I go into my first meeting, and I come from the University of Chicago, where there's a very large Department of Medicine. There were 12 people in the room. 2 were neurologists, 2 were dermatologists, 1 was physical medicine, and the other few people were the faculty that had come down. I was the youngest guy in the room, and I was the instructor. And I looked around, and my initial reaction was, I made a terrible mistake. I really should have stayed at the University of Chicago, even though the job I didn't like. And so what we had to do was begin to develop. But what the advantage that we had, not akin to the advantage that you had, was they cut us loose. A few of us younger people were cut loose and allowed to develop certain things. So, for example, I'd come from Hopkins and Chicago, where the faculty was intimately involved in the outpatient medicine and inpatient medicine. What I discovered at Stanford was that the outpatient hematology unit was not staffed by the faculty. It was staffed by a very good group of voluntary clinical faculty in San Francisco, but the connection of those people with their patients, in and out, follow-up, new intake, didn't exist. And so I said, we have to have an outpatient hematology clinic. So nobody said no. I dealt with your friend Andy Hunt, who then became the head of the OPD, and I established a hematology OPD on Tuesday and Friday afternoon. I was allowed to do that as an instructor. So we were allowed to make moves which began moving the clinical situation forward.
Let me tell you a little bit about the situation in surgery. The recruitment model at the time was the same as it was in other clinical departments, and that is get ahead with a research interest, and the clinical side will take care of itself. Well, I think it's fair to say that that was not who they chose. They chose a man with a research interest, but really didn't have any clinical presence at all, and we depended on patients from the Palo Alto.
University of Chicago. I mean, forget university.
So I got to tell you a story. I show up here from the University of Chicago. They say they've hired 3 surgeons. Harry Oberhelman, I said, great. Tom Nelson, quite good. Garrett Allen's going to be the boss. I said, you can't be serious. Garrett's a disaster.
Can I interject, or do you want to go on? Because in pediatrics, we had a completely different situation. We had the same difficulties where we were going to get patients, but our chairman, Norman Kretschmer, was innovative and felt that rather than having 2 separate programs, one at Palo Alto Physicians, one Stanford, he formed the Unified Pediatric Program, where every patient that came in, whether they were private patients or community or patients from Stanford, were all teaching patients. And he then appointed Dr. Harry Jennison as associate chairman of the department, so that he had input from the community. So every patient that came in was teaching. Now, where were you going to get indigent patients or other patients without competing with the community? He had Bruce Jessup, who had been in practice at the Palo Alto Clinic, set up what was called the Stanford Student Family Practice, where Stanford students who had families could enroll in this program and get care through the faculty. And that was extremely successful. And then he had Dr. Luzzati, plus, of course, Dr. Kretschmer, worked with the people in East Palo Alto to set up a community health service in East Palo Alto, which then fed our program. So it was a unified program. We started to have every patient was teaching. At that time, we didn't worry too much about clinical income because, similar to biochemistry, there were a lot of grant money available. So young people had salaries, not only from the school, but also through grants. And it was a very, very successful program.
Well, you know, it's interesting. Surgery theoretically was much the same. Every patient in the beginning that came in was a teaching patient, even though they were cared for by the community physicians. That's a little bit different. And the reason that was true is because of the house staff. The house staff would help the surgeons with their operations, and then they would be what we call scrub sink teachers. While they're getting prepared, they talk about the operation and talk about why they're doing it, and some were better than others. But in the long run, one had to build up his or her own clinical practice because we didn't operate on the community's patients, although you could help take care of your community physician's patients. I must say that little kids don't exactly know who their doctor is the same way that
Parents do, boy.
but that adults do.
Mom
the parents
does.
aren't there all the time. At any rate,
Mom
it
knows.
was a problem of building up a clinical base, and people approached it differently. Surgery got involved with both county hospitals, San Mateo and Santa Clara. The San Mateo one faded, the Santa Clara one thrived, and it worked out very well because there was something we didn't have at Stanford, emergency room. I mean, the emergency room was primitive at Stanford Hospital originally, but it had a built-in rod and gun club at the Santa Clara County Hospital emergency room. So it was a complementary type thing as the clinical service at Stanford grew. But still to this day, the Santa Clara Valley Medical Center is a very important part of our teaching program for residents and medical students.
We went through the same thing.
And medicine also.
We initially affiliated with CHOPE, which is San Mateo, but that was a small group. It didn't work out. And then we affiliated with the Santa Clara Valley Medical Center, which was a boon because it gave us a lot of patients for our house staff. And the other thing that was helpful was that we integrated our program with Kaiser. So we provided house staff for the Kaiser physicians so that our house staff could learn how to take care of patients in a prepaid medical program. And that has continued to the present.
Well, I'll tell you another advantage for Kaiser. First of all, they have help in working up their patients and caring for them. But the Stanford residency programs become a great recruiting tool or ground for Kaiser when they need more physicians, because the residents have rotated with these surgeons, and if they need another surgeon, they know who to look for, and it's a very attractive practice opportunity
We
for
always
them.
considered ourselves the farm club for
So I got to
Kaiser.
throw one thing in, another source of patients. One of the clever things that happened early on is we negotiated with the VA to have a Palo Alto VA, and which was then, we took over the old Menlo VA as well. And the key was to have a dean's committee immediately, so all of the medicine patients that went to the Palo Alto VA became part of the teaching program, and we were allowed to set up a full equal medicine service at the VA, full-time faculty, including research faculty. That was, and that became a third part of our teaching program.
Same in surgery, and you want to know who the first chief of surgery at the VA was? Yank Chandler.
Yank Chandler.
And then succeeded by Larry Crowley
As
when Bob
quickly as
Chase
possible,
came.
I hope.
But that's the fact. Now, as you know, that VA hospital, this is later on, went down or became non-operative during the Loma Prieta earthquake.
It did.
And there was a feeling that that was going to not be built, it's not going to be replaced. All those patients would go to San Francisco. And one man saw to it that didn't happen, and that was Frank Ebaugh. He walked the halls of Congress, and he made sure that that VA in Palo Alto was rebuilt.
So what you should know is now, our VA is the, I would say, queen of the system. And it's the center of a unique program in the VA called the Million Veteran Genome Project. And that's run out of our shop. And it's made an enormous change because we have a research faculty at the VA and in medicine and neurology and in surgery, and it's made a major impact on our clinical trials.
We've talked a little bit about the curriculum, but we haven't gone into more detail. As I remember, it started off with this 5-year plan with opportunities for electives and that sort of thing, and then became smaller and smaller core, larger and larger elective curriculum until the whole thing was elective. And then we had to define a body of knowledge that each student had to reach through his or her own efforts, and it became quite loose. And that body of knowledge turned out to be the national board examinations, and that was the early evolution. Is your memory of it like that, Paul?
Well, I was part of the curricular reform movement at several stages. And one of them, which led to the completely elective curriculum, as it was called, was motivated by the fact that the medical students are really graduate students. They're essentially at the same stage of development as the PhD student. PhD students are expected to be creative and develop their own programs, and to certainly engage their educational opportunities on the basis of their interests. And so the question was, do we want to just spoon feed the medical students and tell them this is what you have to know, or give them some options to explore in depth some things rather than others? And I think we thought we would try and see how that would work. It turned out it failed, but it failed not because it was inherently bad. It turned out that the medical students themselves began to question, do I really know enough to choose the right course? Who's going to help me decide one way or another? Maybe I ought to not be experimenting with my own career.
Well, this concept, I summarize it by saying faculty gets paid and medical students pay tuition, and the faculty ought to have some role in that medical education.
Well, no. We remained teaching. The courses were the same.
Advising.
There were advisors, but students had to take a certain number of courses in basic science, certain number of hours in clinical care. Those were all required, so it was not fully elective.
Well,
what was elective?
after the full election.
No. During at its heyday, a student could actually skip biochemistry, take pharmacology after physiology, or the other way around. There were no requirements in terms of formed curriculum, and that we thought was beneficial, because sometimes it turns out that students can learn just as well. The order in which is prescribed is not necessarily good for all students.
So I want to
Jim,
pursue
let
that.
me-
Go ahead.
Herb?
Yeah, because in each of these issues we've been discussing, I mean, for example, when you talked about the need for patients, or you, radiology is a referral-dependent discipline, and if the patients weren't there wouldn't be that many there. But this was one area in which, for once in his life, Henry Kaplan did not want to fight. And therefore, he acceded to the two-department pattern. It turned out to be a kind of a pain in the neck for a while, but over time, we got over that. The other thing is the teaching. We had a clerkship for a month, which was kind of elective, supposedly. Every single medical student took that clerkship.
They loved your course.
It
was one of the highly rated courses in the place.
It went on forever, and eventually, anyway, so that's another aspect. But a third one has to do with my own experience. When I came to Stanford, Henry had not quite gotten here. He was about a month or two away. Jones and I were there, and this was the beginning of my residency. And it was great because the culture of the department was determined, was set by Henry, no question about it. So in my first, in the 3 years, I spent a lot of time in the laboratory working. The questions of age and radio resistance and methods of diminishing the hazards and things like that. We had a large mouse colony, and it was accessible, and Henry was very encouraging. So when we came down and there weren't that many patients, that gave us all a little bit more time to get some things done. My first R01 was in about 1956. And from that point on, well, I transferred some of my grants to Boston, of course. And there we got a center grant, which was invaluable in that we could get our own histologist, our own physiologist, our own I mean, we were able to spread these across the whole group. We had 16 PhDs in my department, and they were great to work with. But rather than being uniformly supported by research funds, the clinical funds supported them at the beginning.
Yeah.
And it gave them the opportunity to do whatever the hell whatever they wanted to do. As far as the atmosphere back here, we had some space in diagnostic radiology, and we had a physiologist, a guy named Leo Saperstein,
I
full-time,
remember.
whom we copped from the physiology department,
He was
actually.
a good physiologist
And
on the microcirculation.
we were looking at, as I've always been interested in regional blood flows, and that really worked out very well because we were able to use radiographic equipment and do all kinds of studies.
You know,
I wanted to go back to what Paul was talking about, which was curricular flexibility. So I show up, I'm the youngest guy in the place, they put me on the curriculum committee, and they had a romantic idea about what inpatient medicine should be. So they said, there's no reason to have a medicine service and a surgery service. We have to have a single service because we're all doctors taking care of people using slightly different modalities. So I get assigned to be the first medical attending when we opened the ward in the Edwards building. So who is my surgery counterpart? Roy Cohn. It's a little bit of an imbalance. He's a senior professor, and I'm a new kid. So we are introduced to the service, and I make rounds on the service on Saturday and Sunday. And on Monday morning, I show up. The students are supposed to arrive. I'm there at 8 o'clock, and the resident says to me, the students are gone. I said, what do you mean the students are gone? Roy Cohn swept them up and took them to the OR. They're doing a gallbladder. So it immediately became apparent that this romantic idea of a combined service wasn't going to work. Now, the fun part was, if this happened now, we would have committees and meetings and it would take forever. We solved this problem by Wednesday. We designed 2 services by Wednesday.
And that took, you know, one person we haven't talked about in the detail I think he deserves is Bob Alway, who was the dean of the medical school in San Francisco as it moved to Palo Alto and was still dean here. Now, he must have been foursquare in favor of this move, and he must have been instrumental in seeing that it happened. Is that true? Is that your memory?
Well, I think he was also very, very much involved in the recruitment of Kornberg. I think he and Henry and Avram Goldstein, I think, certainly had him as a strong supporter and partner. I remember Bob Alway was visiting us in St. Louis, trying to talk up about what it was going to be like if we came, and then after we'd agreed to come, kept us fully informed about how things were progressing, the building, the education program, and so on. One of the things which I want to go back to, which I didn't talk about, is I think our coming not only brought this group of 7 to Stanford, but it actually excited a number of people around the country to recognize that Stanford was making a big move, the kind of move you mentioned, in the basic sciences. And so, for example, Josh Lederberg, who had been recruited by Stanford for the biology department appointment, but turned it down, then accepted the appointment when he learned that Kornberg was coming. He turned it down because he said he didn't think Stanford had adequate biochemistry people. But once our move came, he then accepted. Similar example was Charles Janowski, who was a very prominent and exciting young biochemist at Case Western Reserve, or at that time Western Reserve University, and he was being recruited to fill the position that Tatum had left when he moved to Rockefeller. And I think Charlie knew that the biology department was rather old-fashioned, but he came through St. Louis and visited with us, stayed actually in my house on his way to Stanford to do his interviews. And when we described what our plans were and what we were going to create by coming, he then came and accepted the job shortly thereafter and moved and arrived here, I think 6 months before we did.
In the Department of Chemistry.
In the Department of Biology.
Biology.
Yeah. And then Kornberg, I think, also had a lot of influence in appointments that were made in chemistry. And so there was a blossoming of the basic science from just the 7 of us coming all at once. I suspect that might not have happened if Kornberg had come alone.
Yeah.
He would have been spending the first 5 years recruiting a faculty, and it would not have created the same kind of excitement. But the fact that Stanford now suddenly was a major center for biochemistry. You know, I received the Eli Lilly Award just at the time we moved, and right after that I got another award. So there was a lot of ferment that you could feel.
A lot of excitement.
Excitement that was happening. And I think that was one of the benefits of making that move. But I think to also realize that we got an enormous amount of support from the university in those early days. I remember when we moved into the Edwards building, not Edwards, but AM building, if in
Yeah.
the cold rooms were not adequately constructed. There was a lot of leak. And Kornberg just went directly to the president and said, this is unacceptable. And they had people come right in and fix everything, rebuild it.
That's known as leverage.
Yeah, no, but they provided the funding. We had a lot of startup
Now,
funding.
and the labs, the Fleischmann labs were unique at that time, weren't they?
Fleischmann labs were unique. They still are, if they were used the way they were intended. The idea was that there was a series, at the time, the medical class was 64 students. And the Fleischmann labs were set up as individual rooms to accommodate 16 students. So 4 labs would accommodate the entire class. The labs were designed so that there were 2 labs with a space between them called an interlab. The interlab contained all the equipment that would be needed for every medical course that was going to be taught, whether it was physiology, histology, or whatever. So we taught biochemistry in those labs. All the faculty taught students. Postdocs and graduate students were down with the students. And we had access to the most up-to-date equipment, radioactive counters, physiology monitoring equipment, everything. And those equipment were moved into the labs at the time biochemistry was being taught. They were brought back into the interlab, and when those were over, when physiology labs came, a different set of equipment could move out. It was really a remarkable system. Today, it's just overflow, I think, for people who need extra space, and they assign the labs, and they're not used. We do not teach labs anymore.
Yeah, well, part of that is I think that many students entering medical school have had extensive laboratory experience, and it's a little bit redundant.
I think we were eager to try to reach out to other Stanford faculty to become engaged. So,
And something like bioengineering,
Yeah.
for example, could develop, whereas
But that's new. That's
sure, it's
those
new.
are those. Are,
Yeah, but the options-
yeah.
the options for that. I mean, we have more damn people in radiology who are working closely with the engineers and the bioengineers. But I want to make one point. This whole area of change was as much brought about through the intellectual activity of one person, and that's Henry Kaplan, as by anyone. And this starts in the early 50s, you know, before Abrams showed up. Henry was very, very insistent on his own vision for the kind of medical school he wanted to be in. And his strength of character, the fact that he had the best mind in the whole institution, all of these things put together got Kornberg and his crew and Leonard Berg and all of the ripples, all of the waves from one guy, from my point of view.
what I don't know, there's a history which we haven't discussed, and that is what was Stanford University like before the move down. And I can't say that I know very much about it, but I wonder how much collaborations there were amongst the various departments in science in the university before the medical school moved down. But just to give you an example, one of my colleagues, Jim Spudich, who's a professor in biochemistry, began a collaboration with Steve Chu, who was then the chairman of the physics department, who had come here from Bell Labs and got a Nobel Prize for the work he had done there. And they collaborated and developed a totally new approach to studying the nature of muscle contraction. That led to the creation of the Clark Center, because their interaction was seen as being so productive that we ought to find ways to duplicate that kind of thing. And the design of the Clark Center is specific for maximizing interactions from people from different parts of this university. So you have physicians, you have
Engineers.
and you have
Scientists, everything.
computer science, and that is the kind of thing that we need to do more of. But that came out of the interaction between two people in different parts of the university. And I don't know how much of that had happened before we had the kind of people who were seeking that kind of interaction.
Well,
Let me
that's-
ask your opinion on this. The story that I got when I moved on the campus was this was sort of a lazy, sleepy campus
Yes.
until the loyalty oath came. And with the loyalty oath and the people furious at the University of California, we inherited or bought, or our trustees took, an entire physics department which was top-notch. And that physics department was all of a sudden the best physics department Stanford had ever had. And I'm wondering whether that
Right on the board.
stimulated Wally's interest in following up on the physics department with you guys. I'm curious what you guys know about that.
There already existed a world-class chemistry department.
They were good.
They were terrific. The physics department was also Felix Bloch
Yeah, that's what
and
I'm
all these
talking
people. So that part of it on the campus, but interaction amongst the physicists and the biologists probably didn't
Probably
exist.
didn't exist. So then, okay, so the interaction is what you're talking about, made it, and you guys were very good at that. You guys were proactive.
It was one of the things we came for. Every time we would say, why are we here? We came because we wanted to have these kinds of interactions. I should say, being a Stanford faculty member was also very attractive.
I wanted to throw out for your interaction, Paul and Herb, the impact of the loyalty oath. If you recall, this was the McCarthy period, and the University of California at Berkeley adopted a loyalty oath. The entire physics department there, which were Felix Bloch and other people you would know, were furious and decided to leave en masse, and they migrated to Stanford because Stanford's Board of Trustees, even though not the most liberal people in the world, recognized all of a sudden that this was an extraordinary event. So the physics department then moved down to Stanford and became an enormously powerful physics department. But I wanted to ask Herb, was Ginston part of that, and was it, and how did Ginston get together with Henry?
That, first of all, they met. And Henry was very much interested in the linear accelerator, the Stanford. And Ginston, of course, was a prime intellect playing with the group of physicists there. Fuchs, of course, did not accept the concept that anyone over there should get an appointment in physics because they were experimental physicists and not theoretical physicists. And he was, I mean, there was a great big battle at that time. Sid Drell can tell you about it. But the other thing it brings up, San Francisco County was another part of the argument. That was right there, and we were going to, that was a teaching focus.
Focus.
And an extraordinary place. And I
Yeah.
spent 2 years there as running radiology, and a fantastic experience. And Stone, who was the head of radiology at UCSF, finally found out that I was previewing the 3 UC residents as well as the Stanford residents. And he called me up and he offered me a position. I said, that'd be fine. I'd have to check with the dean and whether I can have it, but there was no problem with him or Henry. I called him back. Then I got the sheaf of papers with the loyalty oath. And, you know, I went through it, and I must say I was dismayed. And called him up and told him that I couldn't come. He thought I was attacking him, which I wasn't doing at all, whatever anyone wanted to do. But he was very unfriendly for a few years, I must say.
That's a great story.
Yeah, and
I never knew that.
well, listen, if you got into the system, you had to sign it. And the physics guys went everywhere, not just to Stanford.
Oh.
They did. I mean, they
I didn't
really
know that.
dispersed. It was the greatest department in the country. Before
Were
that.
there other departments that acted like that, I mean, in concert, or was it just that department and individuals here and there?
Probably were other departments, but the physicists would have none of it. I mean, questioning their loyalty, Jesus, they were profoundly upset.
But that was in the early 50s. This
Yes.
took place in 51, 52, 53.
Exactly right.
Okay, well, now we've gotten into what brought us down here, the dynamics in San Francisco, the realities and hopes here. How's it worked out? I mean, is this school, would it be the same without the move? What are the strengths? What are the weaknesses? Have we filled in those gaps that we had in the beginning? What do you think, Phil?
I think it's a great school. I think that the mission was accomplished. It's still being accomplished. So many new programs have been developed. For instance, this program for undergraduate students in human biology, which started off as a sort of a tweaking students who were going into law or to engineering or some other field to learn a little bit about biology. Now, this program has expanded so much, it's probably the largest undergraduate program that we have at Stanford.
Until recently, now computer
Now
sciences.
it's computer sciences, but still bringing people together from sociology, from biology, all of these other programs. It was a tremendous advance.
But the impetus for it, as I remember, it came from the medical school.
Of course.
So
And,
the medical school were the drivers,
That's right.
engaging people in psychology.
David Hamburg was one, Don
Yes.
Kennedy in biology,
and
Sandy
and
Dornbush,
Norm Kretschmer,
and
Josh Lederberg.
yeah, Josh Lederberg.
it's a unique program and has not been duplicated anywhere else.
Not by the same name, but
No, but they tried to do it. There was a reunion, a 40-year reunion of this program a few years back that we attended. And I think it was Sandy Dornbush that said, you know, we had many inquiries about how did you do that? Maybe we could do that at our place. But for one reason or another, it just never happened at any other place like that.
Well, I got to tell you a great story about this. When they set this up, Norm Kretschmer and Sandy Dornbush went to the Ford Foundation. They felt they needed $1.9 million to get this going. They went in and talked to the head of the Ford Foundation, who Norman knew, and they told him what they wanted to do, and they needed money from one foundation. The head of the Ford Foundation said, I can give you $1 million, but I can't guarantee 1.9. And they looked at him and they said, thank you, but no thank you. We want it from one source. And they walked out. Dornbush looked at Kretschmer and said, are we nuts? Kretschmer said, don't worry, in a couple of weeks they'll give us the money. And they got the money.
That's good.
That's a great story.
That's wonderful. They did tell that story at this reunion. What do you think the challenges in this medical school are now? I mean, patient-based still, we've developed the basic sciences, teaching. What are the challenges for the next 10 years?
It's the impact of Obamacare, or what's going to come next, versus the impact on the hospital. And that's partly what I spent a fair amount of time now on. It turns out that the hospital, in contrast to the medical school, is driving our clinical activities now very strongly. And I think concerned about the potential loss of referral base, which is what we've been living on since the 1990s, has driven us to make an enormous change. And we find ourselves in this area competing mainly with Kaiser and then Sutter/PAMF. And then the unit that just woke up to what's going on is turning out to be UCSF. But as probably you know, if you've been watching, we've been buying practices. We bought a practice in San Jose, a hematology oncology practice. We're building a new building in Los Altos. We're opening a primary care unit in Portola. We even have, to my big surprise, discovered that we have a satellite in San Diego. I don't know how that's supposed to work, but
And also in Berkeley.
that's new to me. New one in Berkeley. And so the object there is to lock in, and I've been told this by the people who are involved, 200,000 lives. And they're not called patients anymore, they're called lives. So you have to lock in lives to guarantee a referral practice to keep the referral practice going, which we are still strongly supporting. So this has made an enormous change in how we operate. And as you know, Stanford for many years was rightly criticized for not being very much interested in primary care.
And justifiably so.
An editorial comment from a surgeon. But we hired a very nice man to run our division of general internal medicine. They had either 12 or 15 people in it. He now has 60, and when I last talked to him, they're aiming for 120. So this is a huge change in emphasis How it will impact on the teaching program is an interesting
Well,
question.
you know, this is a phenomenon that's gone on for a number of years, certainly in surgery, and that is we train ourselves out of business. We train these residents to be very good at the new techniques. They go out into the community or to Kaiser or to PAMF and want to perform these techniques, and we got to come up with something new and different to keep ahead of the game. And we're fighting ourselves. We've met the enemy, and it's us. And that's why we've got to get our own. One reason you have to get your own primary care.
That's right.
So I sat with a few of our former fellows. We had a conference here this past Saturday where we invite people back, and I sat with our former fellows who are out there now in the community. Some of them, those have not gone full-time academia. What they tell me is what I've been able to read in the papers. It's very difficult now to find a private practice. What happens is people have gone into group practices, and the group practices are now virtually all owned by hospitals. So in a sense, that whole clinical activity, at least in our area, is very much driven by hospital-based practices. And we are going to be part of that system.
But we're coming in sort of late. This is in Southern California.
Yes.
This has been going on for
Yes.
a long period of time. We're very successful because you can't find an empty bed in the current Stanford hospital.
That's correct.
We have anecdotal evidence from 2 friends in the last 24 hours.
That's right. There's just not enough beds, and we can't wait for that new hospital to be built.
Well, you know, on the one hand, having the large patient base is interesting because my division had this presentation on Saturday, and part of that is marketing. So we are telling the community what clinical trials we have. My division of hematology is small. There are 11 of us. We have 44 clinical trials, which means, you know, how many per person? 4. And I would say these are pretty good clinical trials. How many of them have a base in basic science so that they become translational? And I would say less than 10. And I think, from my point of view, this is a serious deficiency in my division. Is it true of other divisions in the Department of Medicine? You better believe it. So I think the translational base that we had at one time, where you guys were moving closer with us, is fragmenting, and because of the push to develop clinical trials to deal with this need for hospital-based
Well, let me
patient
just
accrual.
say that at least the reputation that Stanford basic science departments have is at the top.
Yeah.
There's no question across the board. And we were the first medical school to actually create a developmental biology. We've had genetics long before any place other had genetics. The interactions between the medical school and faculty and university departments is
Unmatched.
expanding all the time. And we have no trouble. I just came from our faculty meeting. We were discussing 2 candidates that are being considered for this new institute, which is going to be created called ChemH. I don't know if you know about this. This happened to be a Stanford chemistry department professor who was being recruited elsewhere. He's done remarkable work. It's really an amazing thing that he's accomplished. And he was going to leave, but then, as is usually the case, the university comes and said, what will it take to keep you here? And his price was to build a new institute, the Institute for Chemical Biology, and it's going to be located where this current powerhouse is.
Oh, okay.
The
Energy
facility.
Center?
Yep, the one that we have had there for a long time,
Oh, yeah.
right on Campus Drive.
Yeah, yeah.
That institute's going to be built there. The faculty that will staff that institute have to have faculty appointments. So 2 of the people that were being interviewed would have expected might be in biochemistry. I was blown away by these 2 people, these young people, these people who were just finishing their postdocs. They all want to come to Stanford. They had something like 700 applicants for the positions that are available in this new ChemH, what's the way it's referred to, institute. People want to come to Stanford.
So that's good.
It's
I
fantastic.
think bottom line is this medical school experiment, plus the status and stature and forward thinking of the university, has all been very
Yeah,
successful. I mean, I don't think even in the clinical areas, but certainly in the basic science areas.
I was interviewed yesterday by somebody from the Chemical Heritage Society who has been commissioned to do a history of the Beckman Foundation.
Yeah.
Arnold Beckman was a great industrialist, and he founded all these centers and institutes around the country. So they're trying to resurrect this
Bring it all
history.
together.
And we talked about why did Beckman give us $15 million to build the Beckman Center? He had never had anything to do with Stanford. He created an institute at Caltech where he'd been a professor. He created an institute in Illinois where he'd been an undergraduate. And he created this big institute here at Stanford.
Yeah.
And when we were reviewing the comments he made when he was asked this specific question, he said, you know, I've always admired Stanford. It's a great institution. He was talking about the old days as well. He said, but you know, when I met Arthur Kornberg and I met Paul Berg, I realized that this was a special place and that what they wanted to do was something that I wanted to support. And that was to try to bring the basic science and clinical departments closer together, which I think we've accomplished to a much greater extent than we did right from the beginning. So again, here was a man seeing Stanford from afar, evaluating the activities, the people, and willing to put up $15 million to actually make it a reality.
I think the bottom line is if you get great people, they will come. I mean,
Yeah.
everything else follows. You have to get good people and with their ideas, and then money and construction and
All comes
administrative agreement falls in behind them. I think we're nearing the end of our session. I want to thank all the panelists. Unfortunately, Dr. Abrams had to leave a little early, but Professor Berg, Dr. Sunshine, Dr. Schrier have all contributed to a lively and informative session this afternoon, and I thank them all. And thank you.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.